Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff Mom Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And it's time for another Female First.
Yay!
Which means we are joined once again by our friend and coworker, Eve.
I have returned.
The bestest.
We're so glad you have returned.
Yeah, really glad you haven't left us yet.
Yes, it's always a fun time when we get Eves in the studio. You know, having one more person to add to the conversation.
That very, easy, soothing monotone.
Yeah, I actually have a weird thing where I'm not into ASMR or anything, but there's certain YouTube videos I watch that are scary, but they're delivered in such a way that I just am like, oh yes, this horrible thing happened.
So it's just delivered, it's the delivery and the tone that happens, but they're talking about horrible things?
Not necessarily horrible things, because it's not like true crime, it's more ghost sighting or something.
Okay, is it that one dude that has that really weird,
top
monotone?
10 type thing?
Yes.
I know what you're talking about.
I love it.
It's oddly satisfying.
Okay,
but
I can't listen to it. I have to read it. I get frustrated real quick because I'm like, all right, I'm just going to read it because he seems very cool. The dude, I don't know if it's the same dude that's narrating, but I'm like, I got it. Because it's not building up to the...
I love
it's such an opposite of what you're seeing. Like, the ghost is here, but it's like, the ghost showed up. And there it is. Did you see it? Do you believe it?
And then it's like things that a lot of people would agree just didn't happen. It's said in the most plain, this obviously happened.
Right.
Obviously there was a flying saucer in the sky. And there's no discrepancy in that at all, which I appreciate. I mean,
Sure. I'm glad you all knew what I was talking about.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. Because I started watching them and I'm thinking, man, I'm just going to have to turn the volume down and just read it. I'm just going to read it and go back and look at it.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I know some people will write in and they'll say in the most complimentary, I think they truly mean it as a compliment, your voice puts me to sleep. And I'm like, cool, great. I mean, if it's
to
soothing.
you?
Yeah, people have written and said that to me.
That your voice, I think you have a very nice voice. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the three of us had that radio voice.
You think so? I've always been very self-conscious about my voice, honestly, especially when I was younger because I always thought that my voice was deep.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, it was nothing I ever had a real sort of feelings around, but I would think it from time to time.
I think all of our voices are fairly deep.
Yeah.
And that usually is a more soothing tone. Mm-hmm. Definitely been complimented for my voice, which freaked me out a little bit because I'm like, dude. And it's just usually dudes. Calm down. That's so creepy to me, and I don't know what to do with you. But to be fair, Idris Elba, if he was here, I'd be like, just talk to me so I can fall asleep to your voice. Yeah. But that's just me. I don't know. I think the smooth, not necessarily our enunciation or of that, but just the tone. I could see that.
I'm here for it.
All right.
I think we could be late night radio, soft rock.
I'm here for that.
Contempo, adult contempo.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well,
anyway.
In our nice deliveries, we have an amazing person to talk about today. Who did you bring for us, Eve?
Today, we'll be talking about Harriet E. Wilson, who was an author in the 19th century. So she was the first Black woman to publish a novel. And she did the first novel published by a Black person in the United States. So there was Clotel, which was a book by William Wells Brown, who was a Black man, which was the first novel published by an African-American, period. But that was published in London in 1853. And it didn't come to Boston until 1864. So there are those caveats. Obviously, there's a history of, who was the Black person to do this, and what was the label for this, and the woman, and they were African-American, but where did it happen? So obviously when we have first, we have all these other firsts that surround that single first.
Right.
So that was another one of them. But it was also Harriet E. Wilson's novel, and it was called Our Nig. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that obviously a lot in today's episode. But it was possibly the first novel by a person of African descent in all of North America. And we'll get to this later on as well, teaser. But there was another woman in Brazil who was of African descent who also published a novel at the same time. Mm-hmm. Their two names are mentioned together a lot of the time.
Mm-hmm. So a little bonus.
A little bonus. Just a little slight slide in there
Yeah.
and really not not too much.
Oh, it's a shout out.
Just a shout out.
Yeah.
I love it. Again, context so important with these first. So
Right.
very glad that you bring that when you bring these.
Try.
You do.
Love it.
We love it.
We do.
So there's not a lot of information out there on Harriet E. Wilson, and we'll talk about the discovery process of the book because for a long time it wasn't known. It wasn't known that she was a Black woman. It wasn't known that she was the author of this book. And it's in our very recent history that we figured all this out. I say we like I figured anything out. When I say we, I say other people who are like professionals and stuff and do history and scholarship and all those fancy things. But yeah, so a lot of what we do know about her, though, is through the things that those historians and scholars have collected about her life. But those things are still very few and far between. And a lot of what has been pulled out of it has been kind of like this corroboration between what happened in the novel, which is assumed to be autobiographical, and then what happened according to records that have been kept of Harriet E. Wilson. But, and so she was somebody that has been on my list for a long time who I wanted to talk about, obviously, because I'm interested in literary things. And I was in this space where I was just thinking, what am I going to talk about her? Because there isn't so much known about her life, and the stuff that we say did happen may not be the case. We're just deducing those things from the information that we do have. But then I thought about it and I was like, well, she's probably the person I need to talk about the most because that's going to happen so frequently. It's like, well, we don't know anything about. There was already so much of a span where her book wasn't talked about at all because we didn't know who wrote it.
Right.
And she wasn't given credit for it.
And she wasn't given credit for it. And so now for me to say, oh, because there's not that much information about her, I don't know if this can fill a whole amount of time. It just does such a disservice to her legacy, to her honor, and to everybody who cares about literary history and women's history and just learning that, hey, it's okay for us to speak about, it's good for us to discuss these people who have been such an integral part of the history, but also there isn't that much known about them, and that's okay.
Right.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I struggled with that for a while because there would be topics I wanted to talk about, and I just want to read everything about them, and it would be so hard to find credible information, but I didn't want that to stop us from talking about those things. And I think there's a conversation to be had, and it's worth having around why that information isn't there.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
There's a huge conversation, especially when it comes to how much was not documented. And it's interesting to think about that kind of documentation and then what Harriet E. Wilson was actually talking about in her book. She was talking about life as a free Black person pre-Civil War. And so just how much of in her actual life, documentation didn't happen. But in thinking about the idea of slavery, the institution of slavery, and how many families weren't documented or were documented incorrectly and what labels were given to people like mulatto. So I just think it's interesting to think about how we today have gathered and think about her documentation and then what she was actually talking about in her novel, Our Nig.
Right. And it's kind of astounding, that it's recent, as you said, recent discovery. So history, you never know what you'll find.
Yeah.
So I'm excited.
It also kind of brings out the point, how many things have we lost? Like, how many things do we not know with this small discovery? Had this not been a coincidental moment of, and then putting all that hard work to putting it together. At the same time, look at what we probably have missed. You have to wonder of what vast amounts of conversation and then all of kind of history, what was documented and what wasn't, because also at that point in time, education was not offered to everyone, as we know, and equality was far from happening for anybody except for white men. Let's just be really honest. It's kind of familiar, but not that extreme. And talking about also her separation, and I know you're going to go into it, and I'm excited about it, but the difference between the South and the North at that point in time is also kind of like it wasn't as great as you think.
Oh, yeah. I think that that's a myth that's been busted a lot in recent history for a lot of people, at least. I know that my education coming up when it came to U.S. history was very limited and didn't talk about a lot of things or provide context for a lot of things that was related to Black life in America. And in the field that we are in media and the things that we think about as feminists, it's just and living in the South, there's nothing that beats experience. Like something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. So we actually live in the place that so many other people look at from the outside and say, this is how it is. This land of all the misconceptions about the South and also accurate perceptions of the South, but that have more nuance. And that's so in the case of what Harriet E. Wilson touches on in her book. And we're about to go through the whole story, but yes, that's a great point to bring up in the beginning because just to lay the groundwork for this conversation is that, sure, there's a North and there's a South in terms of the geographical boundaries that we create or have literally artificially created, but there is some obvious artificial boundaries, but contextually still actual boundaries between the North and the South because of the way that the colonies were divided and the way that Civil War, yada, yada, yada. This is not that kind of lesson today, but the point of this is to say that it wasn't a clear definition between these people in the South fought for this reason, and the South was wholly and completely racist, and the North was wholly and completely not racist.
Right.
That's not how it was. White abolitionists in the North, if we go back to the days of when there was the Back to Africa movement, the different reasons that people had for wanting Black people to go back to Africa was not just for them to have a better life. A lot of the people who wanted free Black people to go back to Africa, to go to Liberia, to go over there to the continent of Africa was because they didn't want them in the U.S.
Right.
And so there's just nuance.
Yes.
So, and that's one of the big things about her book, Our Nig, and how it was different from so many other stories that were being told at the time of slavery. Yeah, so let's get in. We've done a lot of talking about what it's about, but I feel like I need to give the actual story.
So there's a lot of buildup, so we're here.
So you're expecting this to be so amazing, and trust me, it's amazing in the sense that it's literary history, but it's not the greatest, the most happy story.
Right.
All right.
So here we go. Our Nig is the name of the book, and the full title is Our Nig, or Sketches from the Life of a Free Black in a Two-Story White House, North, showing that slavery's shadows fall even there. And that's my favorite part of the title, showing that slavery's shadows fall even there, because that shows that awareness that she had of these misconceptions about the North, how people thought that, and shadows, just that's a great word.
Yeah.
How people thought that that was a place that wasn't affected by the brutal atrocity of everything, the whole history of enslavement and racism in the United States. So the book is accepted as being autobiographical, like I said earlier, but it's also works within the space of the sentimental novel, which was a thing at the time, and then it also references the conventions of the 19th century slave narrative, which was also a thing that happened a lot. And it's been argued also that the text is often satirical. So I've seen people write about, how it is autobiographical, but we must recognize, and I think this is a great point to bring up, we must recognize Harriet E. Wilson's power as a storyteller.
Right.
That she wasn't just a person who was writing, it was just my life and I'm just going to put it on the page. She was actually thinking about semantics, the context of things that she was talking about, the story she was trying to tell, how she was telling it in an artistic way. She was also a storyteller. She wasn't just I'm putting my life on the page. So the book was published on September 5th, 1859. And in the preface, there's a very short preface in the beginning of the book. Wilson says, and it's just credited as H-E-W in this part, but this is what she says, or writes, "Deserted by kindred, disabled by failing health, I am forced to some experiment which shall aid me in maintaining myself and child without extinguishing this feeble life." And so she goes on to say, "I have purposely omitted what would most provoke shame in our good anti-slavery friends at home." And she goes on to ask her, quote, colored brethren to support her and purchase her book so she could support her child. And we'll see the same story in the text of the novel itself. And so that was kind of a call to action or a call for help on her part, saying, I need you to read this book. I need all the people who support me and defend me. I'm going to censor myself, essentially, is what she was saying in some aspects. But I need y'all to support me so that I can help my child.
Right.
And that is a way to begin a book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. I love start with the call to action right away.
I mean,
Hey, put it right up front. And I'm
Right.
just in here thinking, and I go through this conversation in my head so much, like, what am I creating my work for? Like, what am I writing for? And I
Right.
struggle with this so much. And then I see something like this. I'm like, she was doing it so she could have her child. Like,
Right.
so she
Yeah.
could take care of her child. I'm like, everything that I'm doing just doesn't matter. But I know that's not true. But I do seeing stuff like this, it just helps me put into perspective, why I am involved in the artistry that I am involved in and the struggles. And just how interesting it is that she was creating art, but it was also utility. It was art and utility at the same time.
well, it was very honest, and that's what makes it heartbreakingly beautiful. It's just very honest. This is why I'm doing this. Not only am I going to say this, and I'm going to leave some of the bad parts out because it's not going to be sellable. She knew that. If I don't leave some of, if I don't censor myself a little bit, as well as please understand I'm doing this out of need. It's kind of almost hey, this is not just for my own fame. There's a reason for this.
Well, it's she was almost like her own PR person.
Right.
She did her own media training for herself. And she was like, I know what I need to say to make sure that I get people on my side.
Right.
And I know what I don't need to say.
Right.
So I'm going to not say those things, and I am going to say those things. And I'm going to do what I can to see if I can get the support that I need from people who I don't know. Unfortunately, that did not happen.
Right.
So we'll get to that when we get to the story of her life.
We have some more of our conversation, but first we have a quick break for a word from our sponsor. And we're back. Thank you, sponsor.
Continuing the actual story itself of our NIG, it's about the mistreatment of a, quote, mulatto woman, mixed, named Alfredo, a.k.a. Fredo, in New England just before the Civil War. And her mother in the story was Mag Smith, who was a lower-class white woman, and Mag married a black man named Jim, who was part owner of a coal delivery business. And the two of them have 2 daughters together. The older daughter is Fredo, and Jim dies a few years after the 2 of them are married. Jim and Mag were married. And so soon, Mag marries another black man, and she abandons her children. And at that point, the Belmonts, which were a family of white middle-class farmers in Boston, take Alfredo in, but they make her work as this kind of indentured servant, and they call her our nig. They call her our nig. Mm-hmm. And so Miss Belmont and her daughter, Mary, are basically they abuse Fredo. And just terrible people, physically and psychologically abusive. And her living conditions are unhealthy. Fredo's are, and the rest of the family is complicit because they basically sit back and say nothing. They give her a little bit of egging on, and they're supportive in a way, but they don't actually do anything to help Fredo's situation.
Right.
One day, Miss Belmont hits Fredo on the head for not bringing wood back quickly enough. And so Fredo stands up for herself and refuses to be beaten again. And she does get a little bit of encouragement in that way from the family who tells her, hey, you can stand up for yourself. But there's only y'all know a lot about storytelling. There's only so much you can, so much you can give to the person who's hey,
right.
you can stand up for yourself. It's well, Fredo actually has to take the action of standing up for herself. So I'm not really gonna,
right.
You've seen so much abuse happen already.
Right.
Anyway, over the next year of her servitude, Fredo is not threatened again with that intensity of violence. And her servitude ends when she's 18. So just think about how young she was when all of this is happening. She was a child when she was abandoned, was still a child when she was a servant, and was still a child when she was being abused. And just imagine the amount of, even in this fictional tale, thinking of that is also autobiographical. Give and take, we don't know exactly how much is taken and given, but just that happens so young. Like you're still not finished developing.
Yeah, those are your formative years.
Yeah.
It's when you're like developing life viewpoints and understandings of how the world works.
Yeah. And she left at that point when she had basically nothing, and she was in very poor health. And a Christian woman named Mrs. Moore takes her in and teaches her how to make straw hats. And so she begins supporting herself, Fredo does, with that skill. But soon, a guy walks into her life, a Black man named Samuel, and they get married, and he makes a living giving speeches about his life of enslavement that didn't happen.
Right.
Oh,
Right.
wow.
He's never been to the South, and he does this to garner the support of abolitionists. So, I mean, get it how you live, I guess.
Gotta play that game.
Yeah. The marriage wasn't a good one, and Fredo ended up giving birth to a son at a poor house, and Samuel shows up in her life and leaves again, and eventually Fredo finds out that Samuel has died. So Fredo is in poor health, is unable to support her child on her own, so she has to put her child in foster care. She starts writing her story, hoping that the story is successful enough to make her money to take care of her child.
Right.
So we see the parallel already. That's already been established. And that's basically how the story ends, her appeal to people saying, hey, help me.
Right.
Oh, there's some symmetry there.
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of symmetry. At least don't want to, it's kind of, I'm trying to think the Ouroboros, like the snake eating the tail. Like,
Right.
because a lot of symmetry, but it's like a lot of that symmetry was pulled from the story itself too.
Right.
There are some facts that we're about to dig into, or some inferences that we're about to dig into from that have been learned and collected by scholars about her actual life. So Our Nigga itself was unlike other slavery era stories because it wasn't about Southern slaveholders just being the like villains of the story. Instead, it was about Northerners who were abolitionists, who were committing atrocities. And it went mostly unnoticed after it was released. And it took over 100 years for it to come back into the public sphere and to our recognition. But, you know, there are some ideas about why that may have happened. That could be because it touched on polarizing themes like interracial marriage. It could be because it depicted the racism of Northern white folks. And it also could be because people thought that Wilson was white before we found out that who she was. And yeah, it's hard to tell the extent to which the book was based on her life and what she made up. But it is widely considered to be largely autobiographical. So, on to Wilson's life itself.
All right.
Now that we've covered what the story is about in broad strokes. So, a lot of things have evolved over time with us understanding more about her life and gathering more documents, obviously, as these things work. She was born Harriet E. Adams in Milford, New Hampshire in March of 1825. And she was possibly born to a Black man named Joshua Green and a white washerwoman named Margaret. And her nickname was Hattie. And after her father died and her mother abandoned her, parallel with the story, when she was a child, she was left to become an indentured servant with Nehemiah Hayward and the Hayward family. His wife was Rebecca Hutchinson, and they came from a pretty well-off family with abolitionists in it. Harriet left the Haywards when she was 18, parallel with the story. And she was in poor health at that time. And she started working for other white families, and one woman taught her hat-making skills. And in 1851, she married a lecturer named Thomas Wilson, who pretended he was enslaved but escaped. And in his lectures and his speeches, he decried the horrors of slavery. But he told Harriet that, hey, I was never enslaved. And they had a son, George Mason Wilson, who was born in 1852. He was born on a poor farm in an unhealthy environment. But not long after that, Thomas left the family, and Harriet was still ill and impoverished. And so she left her son with white foster parents and wrote to earn money. And Thomas Wilson soon died at sea. He went off to sea. And Harriet at that point likely travels around Massachusetts and New Hampshire working as a seamstress, a servant, or selling hair products. So she did have a hair product line, which she came out with. And she started writing Our Nig for the same reasons. She copyrighted Our Nig in August of 1859, and it was published by George C. Rand and Avery in Boston the next month. So Harriet's son died of fever less than 6 months after Our Nig was released, when he was only 7 years old. And that was a thing that happened. Like, people died from fever back then. And we already talked about the kind of conditions. They weren't living in the greatest conditions. So, yeah, in the early 1860s, she likely worked as a servant for some time. And she became involved with the spiritualist movement, which, if you're not familiar with the spiritualist movement, and this is not for Anney, because I know Anney knows all about the spiritualist movement. I don't know about you, Samantha, but I know Annie's into horror things. So you are too, though.
Yeah. Not on this level, but definitely up there.
I just want to say to any spiritualist listening, I don't always assume that there's horror involved.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. I'm just thinking like...
right. It comes up.
Mythical and
Right.
and
Yes.
all those types of things.
Like
I
a
figure
mystical
it's in the
thing.
realm of the things that you like are paying attention to.
Yes, that is absolutely a fair assessment.
Because the movement was based on this belief that there were spirits of the dead and that people could communicate with spirits of the dead, and mediums were often the people who could communicate with spirits of the dead. I know we've seen the black and white photos of people around the table and heard about all the like fake things that happened. The people, that was the spiritualist movement. And Harriet herself was described as a medium in contemporary documents. She gave lectures, sometimes entranced in those lectures in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut. And that involvement in spiritualism continued for years and years. For instance, she speaks at the 4th annual Spiritualist Camp meeting in Massachusetts at one point. She was also involved in the formation of children's progressive lyceums, which were essentially the spiritualist version of Sunday schools for children.
Oh, wow.
And throughout the 1870s into the 1890s, she's listed as a trance reader and a lecturer, and worked as a housekeeper at some point during that time. And in 1870, she married John Gallatin Robinson in Boston. So in 1900s, she is described as a nurse at the home of the Cobb family in Quincy, Massachusetts. And that same year, she dies in the hospital in Quincy. And she died of what was listed as inanition, which basically means exhaustion from lack of nourishment. And she was buried in the Cobb family plot. So that's not everything that we've deduced about her story from documents and the novel, but that is a large overview of like her story and honestly a lot of what we know. So that's it. But the other part of this larger story that her story is contained in is the rediscovery or uncovering or recovering or whatever you want to call it of the novel itself. Our Nig itself was thought to be the work of a white author, but there was the book that people thought was the first novel by an African-American woman before we found out about Our Nig was Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, and that was by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And that was released in 1892, which was much later than, we figured out now. Our Nig was written. In the early 1980s, historian and critic Henry Louis Gates Jr., which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with because he has like very public-facing historian and like does a lot of research on history, families' histories and lineages and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And he found a copy of it in a bookstore, and he found evidence that the author of the book was a Black woman who lived in Milford, New Hampshire before the Civil War. And so we're like, this is upending things that we thought we knew about this literary history and who was a part of it. And so he and his colleagues, many people, Gates wasn't the only one to start uncovering stuff about her. And there was a scholar named Barbara A. White who also looked into community records in Milford to learn more about Wilson's life. Those were publishing records. That was census information. And the death certificate listed her son as Black, and that helped confirm that his mother, Harriet, was a Black woman, and her authorship of the book itself. And so in 1983, Gates published a version of Our Nig, and that's kind of when it came back into our sight. So it came back into part of the conversation we were having about who was part of the early history of Black authorship in the United States and in the Americas. Gates has called the book a complex response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And novelist and poet Alice Walker has said of the discovery, quote, "I sat up most of the night reading and pondering the enormous significance of Harriet Wilson's novel, Our Nig. It is as if we just discovered Phyllis Wheatley or Langston Hughes, who are obviously other big names in the history of poetry and the literary tradition in the U.S. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, you know, it's been something a lot more scholarship and conversation has been around. And even in April of 2003, the Harriet Wilson Project was formed in Milford, New Hampshire, which is a resource that you can go to, you know, learn what else is out there about her. Mm-hmm. And it was formed to raise awareness about her life and about her work. And they organized local conversations and discussions of Wilson's work. And they commissioned the creation of a memorial statue to her. So yeah, that is a lot of what we know about her life. And that is a little bit about the context around the uncovering of the book. And the legacy of that is just how, first of all, we're always learning more about who did what, right? Mm-hmm. So before that, we thought that a Black woman didn't publish something in English. That is an important part of this. Mm-hmm. In English in the U.S. before 1892, I think it was. And that's not the case. And it's just like that kind of information is consistently coming out. And we were just learning about that in the early 1980s. Leaves for us to think about what else is uncovered. Mm-hmm. And not only that, her work was also just so unlike other stories that were being told in that realm at the time and was pretty bold and meaningful. I think it's interesting that it was meaningful to her life, like so deeply, because it was connected to financial hardship and her own personal hardship and something that she needed to do for herself. Right. I can only imagine what her thought process was. I'm not a spiritualist, so
right.
I cannot communicate with the dead, but I can only imagine that, like, she really needed to get this story down on paper. Even there was some other sort of purpose behind it beyond just needing to take care of her son, which was a big deal. But she was telling a story that not many other people, as we know it today, were telling it away. She was framing it in a way that was original, like saying, hey, the people in the North do this too.
Right.
And is more powerful because it was her story and told through a vehicle of fictional, like, artistry. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting legacy to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is the kind of intersection there of, I know a lot of people, when they think of artists, they think of the traditional starving artist who moved to LA and, you know, does all that thing. But there is, sometimes I think some people just feel like this need, I have to share this story, it's important. And also, I have a financial need and I have, like, a child and all those things coming together to give, it's just like a very important story that needed to be told, and all of these things happen to coincide with that and make it happen.
Yeah, it does feel like a conspiring, doesn't it? The best kind of conspiring. Like, all these things conspired to have Gates find it and bring it back into our awareness. And a long time, like 150 years, that's a long time. But at the same time, it's not too long because it happened. You know, we got the opportunity to learn about her life because it took so long, because, you know, now we're sitting here and we're able to talk about it because it was that story of her life and of her creation of the work was able to come back to our awareness. So it's definitely a good thing.
So we do have a little bit more for you, but we're going to pause for one more quick break for a word from our sponsor. And we're back.
I will bring up too, which I teased earlier, the other person who published a novel around the same time, and her name was Maria Firmina dos Reis. And she was a Brazilian woman of African descent. She wrote the first novel by a Brazilian woman, and the name of that novel was Ursula. It depicted life under slavery in Brazil. And it was also published, like Our Nig, in 1859. And that work may be the first non-autobiographical work of narrative fiction by a woman of African descent in the Americas.
Wow. Super interesting because obviously this is about survival for her. None of this necessarily, like, yes, she has an outlet, and obviously she was very creative. And when you go from being just servitude to she was a dressmaker. Did I read that at one point?
I think she might have been a dressmaker.
Yeah. And then...
Yeah, she was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So she was a dressmaker to actually writing a book to becoming a medium / a spiritualist who taught children. And it was said that she was teaching white children at that point in time, which seemed to be significant at that point, too. She is a true survivor in the most creative ways that you could think of. Those are not things I would have put together in one individual. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then also knowing that she wrote this book on a scale of, okay, this is my story. I can't say too loudly because people might not respect if they are too tragic, even though it's fairly tragic in the book. And then talking about the fact that also in her real life, there were actual abolitionists around her, if I read that correctly. And she's like, yeah, y'all are doing all these things to free the slaves. That's great and all, but I'm in here suffering. And no one really cares.
Yeah.
What's happening?
I mean, yeah, it's for perspective. It's like there are a lot of different types of oppression, right? And yeah, so while it's just really interesting that she was pointing out how awful it was and to be in the North at that time, it's like that there was no clear division of just because Black people were in the North and they were free doesn't mean that they were free from oppression. Right. So, put simply. And yeah, I agree with you. Like her life, she was very resourceful, obviously very persistent because there was a lot of hardship in her life, but also her life, and I try to do this a lot when I think back especially about Black people or oppressed people's in general's lives, when I talk about them, not talking about them solely in the way where it's like their oppression or hardship defined their stories.
Right. Yeah.
But it was a part of her story. That was a big part of her story that really determined a lot of the ways in which she had to move, right? Which is like writing this book.
Right.
But at the same time, it's clear that she was still able to have a love for life.
Right.
She was still able to participate in the spiritualist movement because it probably wasn't something that was, it wasn't a thing. She lived for a while, which is great. But like, it was something that was clearly fulfilling for her spiritually and emotionally beyond just like it being a financial boon to her life.
Right.
So I do love to think about how skilled she had to be across so many different areas, but also how she still made room for self-fulfillment.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's super important too, that we don't remember people as just like this one dimension, this is the thing.
I was very fascinated with her spiritualist stuff. I was like, what? I was like, did someone just make this up? Because it seemed so out of like left field to me that I was like, wait, what? What just happened?
We talked about it in our Winchester episode, because that's one of the reasons she moved and built the house is because she went to a spiritualist.
Yes.
And she was like, the ghost of everybody that's died by the Winchester rifle. They're mad at you. Supposedly, again, history.
I love the accent that you gave to that. To make sure we got the drama.
It's very ghoulish.
The drama.
Yes, I'm sorry, past spiritualist.
But it was such a beautiful sentiment. It really, because she was talking about creating like candles and all this for the children, and she was doing it for the children. I'm like, wow, okay. I wonder what that actually looks like in that 19th century to sit down and be like, okay, these are the things I'm going to teach you about spiritualism and communicating with the dead, which, by the way, yes, that is the beginning of a lot of horror movies.
I also want to say it's really funny to me, Anney, how careful you are of offending the spiritualists, because I don't really know how many spiritualists are listening to this episode right now.
Never know. They could be listening from the past.
I will say they claim her real hard. Like I found some information on the sites, and they're claiming they love what she did. They see her as a great part of their history. So maybe.
So I find it funny because Annie's definitely like, I don't want them coming after me. But I will say that this is not a value judgment on like what she did or what I thought as a spiritualist. Sure. If you know me personally, very into history, also very into woo.
Did you say very into woo?
Mm-hmm. So there's a room for all of those things in life, and we're not judging anybody.
No, I find it fascinating.
Yeah, we're not judging. We're not judging the lovely Harriet E. Wilson for participating in those things. It's just a part of her story that must be told, and it's an interesting part of her story.
I think it's a lovely part.
Yeah, and I think we forget at that time. In spiritualism was really big after the Civil War as well, because so many people died, and people wanted to find some kind of closure with their loved ones. And I think we just forget that with all of our kind of modern technology and understanding and figuring out how things work, how frightening it must have been. I often think about this with disease, when you just didn't know what was causing things, and you were trying to like, okay, maybe it's that, maybe it's this thing. And so it is, again, context, always important.
Right. Yeah. I guess I never really put those two things together, that time frame, to be honest, because I'm like, historically, I'm just looking at things very historically and moving on, and you see events and move on. But yeah, I guess that's kind of what happens. That makes sense because you need an answer. You need to know why, what was the purpose. But at the same time, because it's also dramatized for us now, moviegoers and all of that. Yeah, that is kind of like, you do put it on a separate realm of, oh, this is in movies and this is in this. So to see it in context to actual person, I'm like, oh, wow. Oh, wow, okay, that's cool.
Like, that's how this happened. Right. Like, I can look at a specific instance of a life and understand how a person can get to that point.
But yeah, and the excerpts of that book were really, really well written. Like her dialogue. There's only I did not read the book. I'm not going to take claim to that, but I definitely read parts of it. That I'm like, wow, she did. She really put into a lot of thought or was able. She was just talented. Period. Because I'm not really good at dialogue in any general writing, but like be able to read that and being like, yeah, I can absolutely see that moment. She did a fantastic job.
Yeah, really good at visualizing.
It's powerful.
Creating images for people to try to understand and empathize. Because I have to imagine that empathy was a big part of this that she was trying to pull out of people because she wanted people to help her. She wanted people to read the book in such an urgent way.
She wanted her
for
child.
such an urgent reason.
Yeah.
Right. And to write that book where she, like the time and place she existed.
Ooh, yes. Yeah. I'm like, ooh, I need a writing schedule. I'm going to get up at 5:30 in the morning. I'm going to write my novel every day. And she's like, I'm working this. I'm going here. I'm doing this. I'm also not in the greatest health. And I'm like writing my book the whole time. And I'm like, I think I'll just sleep and stay in bed until 6:30 today.
Well, and with all the obstacles of that time, too.
Did you say 6:30? Because that makes me feel bad. You wake up at 6:30? Okay.
We no need to talk about that. We don't need to talk about that.
It's like, wait, what just happened?
And I do think one thing I wanted to mention before we end, I do think like the fact that it was rediscovered and uncovered is exciting in some ways sad in other ways is what I'm meaning to say. But we talked before about Wikipedia and how it's only, I think, 17% women. And that's like, no way is that true. No way is that the case that only 17% of Wikipedia entries should be women of history. So just a reminder that we don't know everything. There's a lot of things that have been lost, but there's hope for them to be recovered.
Yes.
So I find that exciting.
And it can be you.
It can be you.
Anybody.
Yes. Those rare bookstores.
Yes, and I'm a big proponent of those edit-a-thons with Wikipedia in specific.
Yeah.
And if you live in, most places have them. You can find a place that does them if that's something you're interested in, but are a little tentative to do by yourself. Highly recommend. Get those women in Wikipedia.
I love it.
Yes. All right, well, it was a pleasure as always, Eves. Where can the good listeners find you?
Oh, all the usual places. So at This Day in History class on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And my name is Eves Jeffcoat. Again, Eves Jeffcoat.
I like how I do that all the time. I pause as if I don't know my own name.
I have to think about it sometimes.
I thought she was just enunciating. It's like, cool.
Yeah,
cool.
I get very many different things for my name. I get Jeffcoat sometimes. And you can also find me personally on Twitter at Eves Jeffcoat. Yeah, and that's it.
Yay, thank you.
Yeah, and definitely go check all that stuff out. It's awesome. And if you want to contact us, you can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can also find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast and on Instagram at Stuff Mom Never Told You. Thanks as always to our super producer, Andrew Howard. And thanks to you for listening. Stuff Mom Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.